Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, dependent on where you are in the world of motoring. Welcome to In Patrick's Wheels, IPW, a new live stream all about motoring from the distinctly jaundiced perspective that we like speed, motorsport, and an opportunity to discuss the history of the four-wheeled automotive phenomenon. Of course, it may be that classic cars are more in vogue these days, given that recent research by IHS Markit shows the average age of cars on Americans' roads have reached an almost geriatric 12 years, with 1 in 4 cars and trucks at least 16 years old. Whether or not said vehicles can soon qualify for a postal vote at the age of 18 is clearly a topic for political debate to come. That's doubtless bad news in terms of the longevity of the automotive fleet in the USA and elsewhere if you're a motor manufacturer, given the way COVID-19 has induced vast losses. Volkswagen, for instance, just lost under $1 billion in the first half of 2020 without even paying any fines for controversial diesel engines. Speaking of budgets, bear in mind this live stream IPO coming to you live today from both Australia, we'll get to our guest Jeremy Braithwaite in a moment, and indeed myself, who is sitting in Valletta, the capital of Malta, the delicious Mediterranean islands just south of Sicily, near the Targa Florio indeed. Speaking of budgets, bear in mind this live stream IPW operates in a historical perspective, not on the classic tobacco-fueled F1 budgets of yesteryear, which arguably appear themselves minuscule by contemporary comparison, but rather we operate on something which, well, without even adjusting for 30 years plus of inflation, comes in well below the sticker budgets of that Formula One era. Come to think of it, in the 1970s, the running joke was that the Merzario F1 team was running on something around the Marlboro sticker budget. Realistically, In Patrick's Wheels is doubtless running on a lot less than the Merzario sticker budget during that era. That's a long-winded way of offering, this is motorsport related after all, a disclaimer. Or, as one might call it, a nerd alert. So, if at any stage you discern an error in the dialogue, by all means let us know. Zero sanctimony approaches are preferred, please. Less sarcasm, more like humour, more gently putting the facts right will be appreciated. Simple fact correction is always going to be a welcome, as is going to be discussion which enhances the debate. Dive in any time on the live stream. Use the box, which is somewhere around the video, depending on how you're looking at this stream, where you'll find us, whether it's on Facebook, Twitch, or YouTube, and make a comment or ask a guest question. By means of rapid introduction, my name is Patrick L. Young, and some time ago in the distant past, I actually wrote for rather a few motoring magazines in my time. I've interjected my relative lack of talent into various media, and indeed some motorsporting events. Coming last in classic rallies was one of my major specialities for many years, usually in highly unsuitable cars. And well, to summarise, I have considerable experience of fast cars, old cars and motorsport, not all of it pleasant. Nowadays, I dabble in race commentary, and I'm the brand ambassador of the Malta Classic, this fine organisation which organises the annual Mdina Grand Prix for historic racing cars on the delightful island of Malta. So let's move on to our guest today. My guest today is Jeremy Braithwaite. I'm delighted to say, although this rather puts us in the aged box, Jeremy, we're both, well, historically interesting. We've been friends for 25 years. In fact, we met just after Jeremy scooped some wondrous laurels for his spirited appearance at the Monterey Historic Festival when Lotus were the featured mark, which I think was the mid-1990s, 1995, if memory serves me correctly. Jeremy, good day to you. There's a clue. Where in the world are you today?
Sydney, Australia. Well, Currajong Heights, if you want to be precise. So we're up at 2,000 feet. We look out over the Sydney Basin, and it's our little sort of cloud nine up here. So
that's magnificent altogether, Jeremy. Beautiful to see you there. And so, tell me a little bit. I'm going to start running. You've got some interesting photographs to share with us today, but tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, basically, my motorsport career started in the mid-70s. I raced mainly escorts with Bob Holden for a while, and did what most people did, ran out of money, and and stopped racing. We bought a house, and I bought a Lotus Esprit Turbo, and we spent most of our time doing Club Lotus stuff. And then in the 1990s, the opportunity came up to buy a Lotus 61, which was the one of the very early Lotus Formula Fords, and that got me back into motorsport again. So, and the picture that Patrick's about to put up, I think, Patrick.
Oh, actually, I'm sorry. I thought I was already sharing. So we're having our first technical breakdown today. Hold on a second. I was quite convinced I was already in share mode.
Yeah.
1 second. Let's see. Are we there?
And so there you'll see a photograph on the left of the Lotus 61 at Monterey in 1995. We went over there with Paul Samuels, who actually introduced me to Patrick. And Patrick, between Patrick and myself, we couldn't work out which of the photographs Patrick took of me at Bathurst. So that both the photographs are of me. The one on the top right is Van Diemen, and the one on the below that is a Reynard. That's the one with 65 on it. So one of those photographs you took, Patrick, we just don't know which one. I'll have to go digging, I think.
I'm pretty sure it's the Van Diemen at the top. I seem to recall sitting watching you coming through that amazing dipper, which was just quite a sensational thing. It took the muscles out of the stomach very rapidly, and that was only watching you.
It was fun. In fact, it's quite interesting. If you want to go and race on a really good motor racing circuit, the first thing that you have to do is to find one with a hill on it. And Monterey in California most definitely has that, and most people associate it with the corkscrew. And Mount Panorama, well, Mount Panorama, it says it all. And the coming down through, well, actually coming through McPhillamy, I think, is the most exhilarating corner of Mount Panorama, certainly in a Formula Ford, because we were completely flat. We were flat from the cutting right through to the top of Skyline. And going through McPhillamy, there was a bump on the way in, and the whole car would just literally do this the whole way through, and you couldn't lift because otherwise your mate behind would get past you. So, and coming down through the dipper was pretty good, and particularly if you had your mate Patrick Young sitting there with his camera going, wave.
Yeah,
sorry.
Sensational stuff. So you had your Formula Ford era. So you worked your way through. You went to Monterey. Tell us a little bit about that.
Monterey was phenomenal. The reason for going was that it was the Lotus year, and Paul Samuels, who I went with, shared the same love for the Lotus marque. He had a Lotus 15, unusually with a 2.5 litre Climax engine, which I think they now say in historic motorsport in Europe is illegal, and they don't allow it to race because all the other 2 litres can't keep up with it. Anyway, this car was called Alice. Paul spent quite a lot of time racing it in Europe, and he used to send epistles back from Europe recounting the tales of the Lotus, and he called the Lotus Alice, and the tales were called Alice in Wonderland. And for those people who have their old copies of the Oily Rag's a lovely name for a historic motorsport magazine, isn't it? Anyway, for those who have those, they can look back and read the tales of Alice in Wonderland. So anyway, Lotus was a featured marque. We actually had it at the first ever, I think the first ever all Lotus Formula Ford race. I think there were some non-Lotus cars in the original one at Brands Hatch in 1967, and they were mainly Lotus 31s with a Formula Ford engine put in them, and Lotus 51, which was Lotus's first Formula Ford, and we had a field full of predominantly Lotus 51s at Monterey. I had the only Lotus 61 there, so it looked very modern compared to the earlier cars, and they very kindly gave me a Chopard watch for my race. You didn't have to win the race. You just had to be the outstanding competitor that they noticed. And I think being the only Aussie in the field helped. And Paul won the Driver of the Meeting Award, and it was called the Denny Hulme Trophy. Anyway, we had this lovely prize giving, and I went up and got my watch, and Paul went up and got his piece of timber from New Zealand and came back and said, "I'll swap you." But Paul's no longer with us. Brendan, his son, very kindly gave me the trophy, and it hangs up next to me in the study. So yeah.
Well, yeah, he was a great man, Paul Samuels, and of course he went on to build the historic racers circuit in New South Wales, Wakefield Park as well, amongst many other achievements. What a character, really, really sensational together.
Well, if we move on to the next slide, I've actually got a photograph of him.
Oh, there he is, indeed, in his Monterey cap, always looking like a gentleman driver at all points in time. Paul, he was really, really fantastic character from start to finish, larger than life. And indeed, as you say, in the magazine of the Historic Sports Racing Car Association of New South Wales, the Oily Rag, he had many epistles from his travels around the world. Now, what about this fascinating gaggle of Jaguars?
Well, Paul loved everything that was 1950s and British. And he put on this event, which was by invitation only, for people who had a car that could have run at Le Mans in the 1950s. And the D-type Jaguar that you see there belonged at the time to Keith Berryman, another good friend of ours. And that car, in fact, has since been sold. And I understand it was bought by Mr. JCB, Sir Anthony Bamford. So it now resides in the UK, and I think somebody told me it may now be in a Curie Coste Blue, but I'm not entirely certain of that. If you at the end of this, we're going to put a link up to a PDF with all these photos in, and if you have a look at the bottom on pretty much each of the slides, we've got a link to my photo site. And so that 1950s day at Wakefield Park, you can see all of the other people who were there. Because we had the circuit to itself, I was there with my camera, and because we had the circuit to ourselves, it was fantastic. I could get into the gantry where the starter sits and take photos of the cars going under me, and I could wander out onto the marshalling posts and get a view that you'd normally only have to be a marshal to get. So it was a lovely day. It was freezing cold, but we'll leave that one aside.
Well, it was Goulburn prone to some extremes of temperature as it goes on. So therefore we move on to another D type of interest, which also had an Australian side story.
Well, this is Jumbo Goddard's D type, and it was at Bewley. This photograph was taken at Bewley, and if you have a look on the bottom left-hand corner of the windshield, that's looking bottom left-hand if you were in the car, you'll see a New South Wales registration sticker for August, I think it is. And Jumbo had this car registered for the road, as in fact did one of his predecessors, Bill Pitt. And there are lovely stories of Bill Pitt taking the car to Bathurst and crowds turning, and he used to have a radio show, and crowds used to turn out along Bell's Line of Road, which is near where we live actually, to watch Bill going in the D-type up to Bathurst with his foot flat to the floor. Anyway, Jumbo had the car, and I don't think we could. Or do you want to read out what we've got there, Patrick? Or
well, it's fabulous, isn't it, by Doug Nye. Jumbo never wore socks, held his trousers up with a lanyard, had a fetish for fitting his cars with an enormous number of dashboard instruments, made a fortune on the New Guinea gold dredge, had served before the mast on sailing clippers rounding Cape Horn, served as mate on the replica of the Mayflower, which he, Skipper Alan Villiers, and their crew sailed across the Atlantic on the anniversary of the Pilgrim Fathers' celebrated emigration. Happily self-indulgent, wildly enthusiastic, and pretty much, during the period I knew him in the 1970s, 1980s, completely potty. He married the former secretary of Chris Shorrock, the supercharger specialist very late in life, had a wonderful house on Sydney Harbour. On one Bugatti rally in France, he found his float had sunk on his Type 51, causing it to run exceedingly badly. At the lunch halt, which was at a very highfalutin chateau, he marched into the hotel kitchen with the offending object and proceeded to boil the fuel out of the float over one of their open grills. The car ran on methanol, and hey presto, the methanol detonated with an enormous bang. And you know how exploding acetylene leaves flakes of ash floating in the air? Well, so did the methanol. The hotel's ready to be served, and very expensive desserts all being covered with jumbo Bugatti devastated kitchen, completely oblivious to the chaos about him, with hatless chefs running about in all directions screaming sacre bleu. Ooh, another naughty word. And sapristi, whatever les bleus may say when events go completely pear-shaped, rather like the first half at Twickenham this afternoon, whatever that refers to. Great quote there from Doug Nye.
Anyway, so
XKSSs, where
the closest that I ever got to Jumbo Goddard was I managed to purchase at auction his copy of Touch Wood by Duncan Hamilton, and it's actually autographed to Jumbo by Duncan. So that is a fantastic read for anybody who likes to read about people who are reasonably insane.
Fantastic altogether. So back to the, it is actually Touch Wood, it's superb, where they find the car in the cellar after the war, if I seem to remember correctly. Yes.
And everywhere he went, people said, you can't possibly still be alive.
Yeah.
Anyway.
For multiple reasons, not just motorsporting. Yeah.
So I thought we'd carry on with a few more Jaguars, and these are a couple of replicas, and one, the particularly nice XKSS belongs to one of our Thoroughbred Sports Car Club members here in Sydney, and his name is Norm Johnson. And below that is a D-type replica that we owned for a short period of time. And I think it was the first D-type replica ever to be built. And they had a lot of assistance it was built in Tasmania. They had a lot of assistance from the factory. And the black and white photograph shows the car being built by a very bearded gentleman in Tasmania. A lot of fun, and I guess at the time I thought, well, I'm never ever going to be able to find and afford to run a proper D-type. That was as close as I was going to get, and it was pretty good
at that point in time. And of course, it was a long journey for you because you started. I mean, you moved to Australia some years ago, and here we see a couple of intriguing photos. I'm sorry, one of them seems to be slightly cut off perhaps in the aperture of the presentation. Tell us about this. 1968, I believe.
Yeah, the Crystal Palace, start of the London-Sydney Marathon. And there's a bit of a tale attached to this because I took the photos, and a couple of years ago, we actually had a London-Sydney Marathon reunion. And I shared the gallery photographs with quite a few people who were in it, some of whom were in the original London-Sydney Marathon, and some of whom were in later versions of it. Anyway, and at the time, I was in the Classic Rally Club, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in another slide. But the Vauxhall Ventura actually belongs to one of our members, Laurie Mason. And Laurie is organising a rerun of the London-Sydney Marathon Australian component. So they're starting in Perth. This is later this year in November, I think. And they're starting in Perth and following the original rally route to Warwick Farm here in Sydney. And the car today looks as pristine as it did at Crystal Palace in 1968. Anyway, with all the email toing and froing backwards and forwards with Laurie, we actually turned up a guy called Ted Taylor, who is the current owner of the Land Crab, the Austin 1800, that's cut off in the top of the photograph. I'm sure we can fix that before we send it out to everybody. And he was absolutely thrilled to find an original photograph of his car at the start because he didn't have one. So anyway, lots of London-Sydney history. And if you go and have a look at the link, you'll see some pictures of the reunion we had a couple of years ago, and quite a lot of London-Sydney marathon history there, including videos of all the people who spoke at that reunion.
Fantastic.
And one of those was John Smales, who's written a fantastic book about it.
That's super altogether. And ladies and gentlemen, if you've got any questions for Jeremy, ping a message on chat anywhere, wherever you're reading this or watching this in your browser. Send us a message. We'll be happy to respond to you and have a look at what's going on. Here we're jumping 20 years into the future. This looks, has to be said, an amazing tango of Mitsubishi.
Well, and as with all of these things, Patrick, there's a bit of a tale attached to it, so which we will tell over a couple of slides. So this particular picture has Peter Mackay, who's a very well-known and very well-respected Sydney motoring journalist at Amaroo Park, which was an incredible racing circuit built in it was like a natural amphitheatre in northwest Sydney. And a very tight circuit up and down a hill, and this is coming onto the pit straight, and Peter's in the factory car, and literally looking as though he's drifting is our friend Greville Arnell in the Miami Mitsubishi Starion. And I just think it's just a superb photo. Peter posted it on Facebook earlier this year, and I have no hesitation in stealing it and sharing it with all of your guests. So
fantastic, super pick. Do we know
it is? Anyway, so if we move on to the next slide, we'll tell you a little bit more about Mitsubishi Starions. The picture, the main picture, has got Greville's car at Winton in 1985. It was, I think. And this was the first Group A race in Australia, and in front of him is our world champion Alan Jones in the factory Alfetta GT, GTV. Get that
GTV,
right?
Yeah.
GTV, yeah. And anyway, Jimmy Richards, from memory, won that race in the 635 BMW, but it was a pretty good event. Anyway, above that, with the Australian flag draped all over the car bonnet, is Jeremy and Julie in our Mitsubishi Starion, which we've still got in. And this was at the 20th anniversary of the Classic Rally Club, and we had a two-day event starting at Mudgee. The history of Greville and Jeremy and Starions goes back to 1982 when they were first released, and I'd actually ordered a Starion from another dealer, and a friend of mine's father was the finance guy at Purnell's in Bankstown, and I got this phone call saying, "Look, if you want a Starion, Jeremy, there's 12 arrived completely unannounced at Purnell's, and if you wander down there after work, my friend's dad will meet you there, and you could take your picks." So I chose the white one, and that Starion was chassis number 00000034. So it was a very, very, very early build, and I suspect it was probably the first one registered in Australia, or certainly in New South Wales, unless the factory got one registered before, but we don't know that. Anyway, so that was my Starion. And a little bit later, we moved up to the Gold Coast. I had a job up there for 12 months. And I got this phone call from Greville Arnell. And we used to race with Greville's brother, Lyndon. And Lyndon was a professional driver driving for Bob Holden in the 70s. Anyway, Greville said, "I've got to build a Coles New World at Ballina. So if you've got a house in the Gold Coast, come and stay." So anyway, so a couple of weeks later, Greville arrives. And he's also got a Starion. And so I think we probably had the first two Starions in Queensland, which caused a reasonable stir on the Gold Coast. Anyway, and back then in 1982, there was nothing like the Starion. I mean, they really were something that came back from the future, you know. And anyway, so Greville's, our car just remained a road car, but Greville's car became a Group E car, and he raced it in we got some local support from Miami Mitsubishi, who were down the road from us, and then he did more work to it, and it became the first Group A Starion, actually, and that's it racing at Winton.
Incredible. I actually saw just a moment ago, second behind the factory car there at Amaroo Park. Yes. Quite amazing altogether.
And the Starions won everything in their day. Certainly in Group E, the factory didn't put the effort and the work into homologating the bits they needed to be competitive in Group A. But anyway, lots of fun, happy days. All right.
So we move to Monaco, the venue of the great Grand Prix and the historic Grand Prix. I do believe this was the first historic Grand Prix.
It was, and you might mention to your viewers, Patrick, that you were a Monaco resident back then.
I was indeed. I had a very small, compact and bijou residence in Monaco, which enabled me to be a member of the Automobile Club for a number of years as well.
So the picture is a friend of ours called Ivan Glasby, and Ivan came from South Africa, and his dad had been, I think I'm right in saying his father had been the Cooper agent for all of South Africa. And Ivan moved to Sydney, but he knew where every important car was in the whole of the South African continent, and he became very, very good at unearthing them and restoring them and sometimes trading in them. Anyway, he had this dream of going to Monaco for the first historics, and the car, I think, left Sydney in pieces from memory, and was dispatched to John Harper's workshops in England, where Ivan promptly followed, and John had him working on customers' cars, getting the transporter ready, although he couldn't have got down to Monaco, and then eventually found a little bit of time to fettle his own car, and they got it all working, and he got it down to Monaco. And I can distinctly remember being asked to go to the local chemist and see if we could get a litre of acetone. And I marched into the chemist and in my best French aspirate, and the chemist didn't even bat an eyelid. He went right at the back and came with a litre of acetone. Now, where else in the world could you do that?
I remember that day very well, because Ivan got lapped just on the flag, more or less, by the winner and nobody else. The winner then promptly slowed down and got terribly excited over his great victory, at which point in time, Ivan very elegantly unthreaded himself, unlapped himself, and went on to do his final lap of the race. I think, given the fact it cost something like 5,000 to enter, every lap was costing him about $400 at that stage. So I can quite understand why he wanted to get his money's worth. It was a great, great event. And that actually brings us up to date with, well, a slightly more modern version of the same Grand Prix, I do believe.
Absolutely. So we went back a number of times, and it was always a good excuse to catch up with Patrick in Monaco. And at the time, this is early 2000s by then, by that time I was working for a France telecom subsidiary. And I succeeded in convincing my global boss that it would be a very good idea that if we had an annual get-together in Rennes. Rennes is sort of pretty much the center of the telecommunications world in France. And my boss thought that would be a very good idea, and we agreed a time that coincided completely with the historic Grand Prix. And I flew over to France in Air France, by Air France, and they very usefully had if you fly Air France into France, they'll take you to another major city return as part of the deal, no extra cost. So I nominated Nice. We couldn't nominate Rennes because it wasn't a major city, so the company had to pay for that leg of the journey. And Patrick pointed out to me that the helicopter was cheaper than the taxi flying from the airport at Nice to Monaco. So I actually succeeded in getting that on expenses. Anyway, so it was every time we went to historic Monaco, it was a no-cost trip. And until we went there in 08, and by that time I'd retired, and we had to pay for it. But we thought, well, if we're going to go over, then let's do it properly. And in the old days, we just used to get a fax sent over from the editor of the Orly Rag, and we would get official accreditation without any problems at all, and we could wander wherever we wanted. It was rather good, Patrick, wasn't it? I mean,
it was excellent.
You'd never go and watch a motor race any other way other than with a press pass, would you?
Well, it always was a joy. The only thing that was a bit of a pain was carrying around the umpteen kilos of equipment, but particularly on the hot days that there were in the couple of historic Grand Prix that I can recall wandering around like that. But on the other hand, I mean, standing on a balcony or on a yacht, quaffing a few glasses of champagne is not such a bad way to approach these things either. There are things to be said for either approach. And in fact, speaking of that approach, I mean, ladies and gentlemen, if you're watching this, do by all means send us a message, give us a comment, tell us anything that's happening that you would like to to hear more of, or more that we can talk about. We'd be very, very interested to hear your comments. And as we carry on through, just briefly, we're going to see here a tribute to a true racing great, Sir Stirling Moss, his Cooper winning the Grand Prix de Monaco in 1960 actually sits in my living room wall, just on the other side of this makeshift studio. This is him. I think it's his last historic Grand Prix. You reckon?
I suspect it was, Patrick, and that was taken as he drove through the swimming pool complex. And there's a little low wall there, and I don't actually understand why there's a low wall and no arm coat, but there is this little low wall, and that's all it is. And literally, the cars come past you with a couple of inches to spare. And I suspect that's been changed now, but it was just so fabulous as a photographer to be able to walk around Monaco and to get so close to the cars. Anyway, we got home and we produced a book from it, and the book is called.
Let's see the cover of the book, Race Face.
The book is called Race, and it's A3, and I don't know where it's going to open, but let's just open it somewhere in the middle. And it was just a delight to put this thing together. And anyway, so we got back, and we had great difficulty finding somebody who could produce a book of A3 size. But I thought, well, there's no point doing this unless you actually make it sort of a bit substantial. And the greatest difficulty was actually finding somebody in Sydney to do the hand binding, and they eventually ceased business. So it started as a limited edition, but it became even more a limited edition halfway through the run.
But it's a fabulous book. If you can get a copy of it, it's really worth a read. It's a super review, because the pictures are quite incredible. So we move on to something fairly sublime. This does not look altogether pleasant. Actually, when we were looking originally at a thumbnail, I thought the main picture was a motorbike.
Well, the A1 GP came to Sydney in the early 2000s, and this I think was 2005. And when we got to the circuit, the FIA, in all their wisdom, had succeeded or required the circuit to install kitty litter on the outside of Turn 1. Now, Turn 1 is at the end of a very long straight, and in a Formula Ford, we'd go into it at about 220. And absolutely flat the whole way through. It's a right angle corner, and we'd scrub off probably about 15 kilometers an hour and emerge at about 205 on the exit of the corner. Anyway, the Japanese gentleman in the photograph got halfway through the corner and then thought, well, I've got another 40 horsepower if I hit this button on my steering wheel, which he did, and it promptly sent him straight off the outside of the corner into the kitty litter. And of course, the moment it hit the kitty litter, he started to turn over. And if you have a look in the second photograph down the bottom, you can see the car is face down in the gravel. And if you look back up at the main picture, you can see that the roll bar has actually been removed from the car.
Yeah, he's a very, very lucky man, Mr. Shimoda, wasn't he?
Well, and if you look at the picture, the third one on the right at the bottom, if you have a look at that, he goes head first into the concrete walls below where I was standing. I have, and the main picture was taken after that. I have no idea how he survived it, and he had no significant injury. It was quite astonishing.
It's incredible. I mean, it's a real testament to good luck and also even the strength of cars by 2005. Now, that moves us to a whole different era, because we're looking at, well, items that I think would cause the average health and safety person to probably have a hissy fit. I mean, I should have given a trigger warning before we flicked over this for millennials who are concerned about safety. Enfield, Indians rather than Enfield. Talk me through this, a great New Zealand figure.
Well, the World's Fastest Indian was an absolutely incredible movie.
Yes,
and we were visiting New Zealand actually on a thoroughbred sports car club tour of the South Island, and I said to Julie, we've got to go down to Invercargill, where they've got this collection of Burt Munro's bikes and memorabilia. And Burt came from Invercargill. And anyway, we came down and we stopped for a coffee at a pub on the way into the town. And we were talking to the lady there, and we asked her where Hayes Hardware was, because we'd heard about it. And she told us how to get there. And we asked her whether she'd seen the movie. And she said, yeah. And the next question obviously was, well, how accurate was it? And she said, well, it was pretty good. But there was only one thing they got badly wrong. It wasn't a boy that whittled on the lemon tree. But Bert had used to have two red flags in his shed, and he gave one to this lady and another one to her sister, and they lived next door. And they'd go out at either end of the street that Bert lived in, and Bert would take the latest incarnation of his Indian and go and test it up and down his street. So anyway, that was the history. So all this memorabilia is in the local hardware store. So they just cleared an area in the hardware store, and they've got all of these really precious items in there that tell, the story of the town's most famous resident. It's absolutely glorious.
And the
film. Sorry, Patrick.
No, I was just going to say the film is a gem, The World's Fastest Indian. It really, really is beautiful. It's a magnificent film about the whole concept of one man's utter speed mania and deciding that he was going to go from New Zealand to Bonneville to the Salt Flats and set all manner of incredible records. It's a beautiful story.
And which we experienced in '95, the way the Americans made him feel welcome was also, I thought, captured really nicely on the movie. So
that's superb. So from the sublime to the ridiculous, talk us through this interesting farrago.
Well, I'm a great Jenson Button fan. I think he's a real gentleman, and he's a really good racing driver. And when he was sponsored by Vodafone, they decided to do this was before the Grand Prix. They decided to get Jenson over the previous year's Formula One car and get one of our local racing heroes, Craig Lowndes, to come with his V8 supercar, and they were going to put it, give them both a run around Mount Panorama, and Jenson was going to be the first guy to drive a Formula One car around Mount Panorama, and Craig Lowndes was going to get to drive his car as well, and so they did. But the real excitement of the day was the helicopter pilot, who was absolutely set out to make the best movie of Jenson. And if you have a look, and he did it lap after lap, if you have a look how close he gets to the marshal's post, you cannot believe he didn't hit it. So.
It's incredible. It's absolutely, it's just a gripping picture altogether, because, he definitely was channeling his Con Air Vietnam psychosis or something when he was flying around following his racing cars. It's an absolutely magnificent picture altogether, Jeremy. Thank you very much. And then this is a little bit more of the same, but somewhere in the middle, we have something very interesting. Is that, do I espy a Honda Formula One car?
Yeah, and the Honda Collection Hall is at Twin Ring Matagi, and for those people who've never been there, it's really got a bit of a Nürburgring flavour to it. It was the Honda test track, and it's built up in the mountains, and they've got this magnificent building where they've put a lot of their collectible cars in, and the cars that are in there pretty much run up to the mid 1900s, like the NSX is in there, the S2000 is not. And but there's a lot of the history of Brabham and Honda, because you'll recall that Brabham's Formula 2 cars were Honda powered, and there was a really great relationship there. And Ron Tornak, who we lost a few weeks ago, aged 95, would you believe? He also had a relationship with Honda with his routes. So
famously, you say he had a relationship. In the 1980s, he produced perhaps the most dominant Formula 2 car of all time, with those works routes, which were powered by Honda and were driven by, if I remember correctly, Jeff Lees, amongst others. They were absolutely magnificent machines. Yes.
And anyway, so this is 2019. We went there and we went to the Super GT race. at Twin Ring Motegi, and the picture on the bottom left-hand side of the corner of the screen is Jenson Button, who won the race and won the championship. So he was Honda's Formula One world champion, and then to be Honda's, they were driving an NSX, then to be Honda's Super GT champion. Well, he's a popular boy in Japan.
Yes, I'm sure he has no difficulty in managing to find a reservation for any sushi restaurant in the country these days.
The Japanese Self-Defense Force put on a really good aerial display, and I really like the photograph on the top left.
It's magnificent.
And Honda have this robot, and anyway, if you go to the Honda collection hall, the robot will come out and it'll play with a football and tap dance and do a whole lot of stuff for you, and it's all pretty impressive. Lovely.
Probably will be signed for what 2025 Grand Prix season. They'll probably find a way to put him into the mix. I would imagine. So we're moving on now to Nissan, and of course, but a Nissan, a 23 Nissan, the ultimate iconic car, because of course Ni and San is 2 and 3 in Japanese, which is why they've always loved running around and about 23 as their team numbers in racing around the world.
Well, it's interesting you say that, Patrick. Not many people know it, but I've actually got 23 ZZZ on my 300ZX twin turbo. As a number plate. And you can get a number plate in New South Wales that's got a whole lot of Japanese hieroglyphics on it that actually stand for Japanese domestic market. And anyway, that's completely an aside. We were lucky enough, and thanks to our good friend Peter Landon, we were able to get into the Nissan Zama Museum, and it is unbelievable. It's in an old Nissan factory. You have to apply to get into it about 30 days in advance. You can't apply before that. You can't do it 6 months in advance, for example. And they give you a lovely lecture in Japanese before you go in about a little bit of Nissan history, and then they allow you to walk through this place, and it is every collectible car, both production car and motorsport car, that Nissan has got under one roof, and it is just incredible. Again, a lot of Brabham history, particularly in the US. And on the back wall, there's all the old rally cars that that have done the safari and done our rallies in Australia. They've got all the old Group 7 cars there, which I didn't even know that Nissan had made. Just an absolute treat of a day. While we were there, we also went to Nismo. And I put a picture of the R35 that we ran for a few years in the bottom right, and that's up at Mount Hotham. The Great Alpine Road is one of the best driving roads in Australia, and you get up to the top, and that's the view that you get. And the R35 was just superb on those roads. Everybody should own one once in their lives. It's sub 3 seconds to 100 kilometers an hour. It just grips. You've got to trust it, but it just grips. And if you occasionally drive carefully, you might just keep your driving license.
Yes, there are a number of them around Malta, mostly driving on only weekend plates. So yesterday, because it was a bank holiday, everybody was out in their R34s and R35s. Although admittedly, given the lack of expanse on this beautiful island, it was somewhat difficult to wind the thing up, but I'm sure you can still get a speeding ticket in it without too much difficulty. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for the likes. We are seeing some stream of social media already. Really appreciate it. Glad you could join us on this fine summer Sunday morning, or indeed winter's evening if you're in Australia. If you've got a question for Jeremy or a comment, do drop them by. Thank you very much. And then we get to, from the sublime to the ridiculous. It has to be said, the Batmobile remains to me simply sex on wheels. And this is a magnificent example. Talk me through the design of this particular livery, Jeremy.
Well, it was designed by a gentleman who originally hailed from Sydney, called Jason Fong. And Jason, I think, is, and a lot of other people think, would have to be the best motorsport and motoring photographer out there at the moment. His work is just delightful. I've got a link at the bottom of that slide to his website, but if you Google Jason Fong, it comes straight up. This particular car, he did the design of the colours on it, and then went to photograph it, and what a job he's done. It's just super.
Magnificent.
Yeah. Anyway, you can spend hours going through his website, and it'll take your breath away.
Oh,
moving on to the last time I was in Malta, the only time I've been in Malta, Patrick and I were at the Malta Air Museum, and we met a guy called Raymond Polidano, I think his name.
Yes.
And he said, "Where are you going?" And we said, "Well, I said we were going to Italy." And he said, "If you're going to Italy, you have to go to the Italian Air Force Museum." And I'd never heard of it. I don't think you'd ever heard of it, Patrick.
No,
anyway,
absolutely not.
We looked it up, and it's on a lake. It's about 40 kilometers north of Rome. And we arrived, and there were no big signs up to it. We found a little sign close to where we thought the entrance was. And there was a guardhouse. There was a gate halfway across the road, and I thought, well, we're here. We may as well see if we can get in. So I went into the guardhouse, and the lady explained to me, my Italian's not that good, but anyway, we communicated, and she said, yeah, go in through the gates, park around there, and the museum's down by the lake. So we did it, and the place is just unbelievable. And the picture at the top shows all of the Italian Schneider trophy planes all parked in a row, and the top one of the lot, which is in the bottom left-hand side of the photograph, is the MC-72, which they got to do over 440 mile an hour, and it's got contra-rotating propellers. It's got two, I think they're V16 engines in line astern. You can just look down the side of it. Each of those things is an exhaust port. And if you go back 20 years, Wilbur Wright came over with a Wright Flyer to show them how to fly. And you just cannot believe that any nation could go from the Wright Flyer. And if you have a look at the link and go and have a look at my photos of it, there is actually the Wright Flyer that they bought from the Wright brothers. And to go from there in 20 years to something that probably should have won the Schneider Trophy if the Spitfire hadn't got there first, it's incredible. And on the right-hand side, of that photograph is the prancing horse insignia that was given by, I wrote his name down.
Federico Baracca. That's my guess.
You're ahead of me, yes. It was given by his mother after he died to enter Ferrari. And anyway, and everybody knows what happened to it after that. So all of that memorabilia is also in the museum, as well as some more modern stuff. They've even got a Spitfire, and I had in there in Italian colours. And a lot of people don't know or don't remember that Italy actually fought two wars while the rest of us were fighting one.
Well, the rest of actually, Spitfires were a great export market during the course of time. And speaking of another great export, well, here we have Alan Jones's Williams, number 27, which I remember very, very well, watching it in period. Tell me very quickly about the Fremantle Motor Museum.
Well, you remember Peter Briggs because you...
good man, very good man altogether.
Yeah, and Peter was at the first Monaco Historics in a Ferrari. He managed to acquire on rental from the Port Authority a very large building next door to where Bondi's yacht is housed, and he put an amazing amount of machinery into the museum. It all came to an end when the Port Authority got greedy and decided to jack the rent, and Peter said, "I've had enough of this." Peter also has a museum out at York, and if you look under motor museums on my SpagMug site, you'll find a couple of visits that we've done to York. But I put that 4-cylinder Jaguar engine up there because I can't remember the signage that was with it, if there was any, but there were only 4 experimental Jaguar engines built. And I suspect this is one of them. So for Jaguar aficionados, there's a bit of history there. So
fascinating altogether. And of course, York was also the home to some great road racing, a little bit in the style of the Mdina Grand Prix as we have here annually in Malta. But tell us very, very quickly about Lake Percolilly, because this sounds like just the revenge of the mad motorists.
Well, there's a link on there to a story that was done on the visit to Lake Percolilly by a friend of ours, Les Johnson, and that's Les's son Rick on their overland. Now, a couple of years ago, Les organised a get-together for all of the overlands in Australia. Now, this is a mark that in the past had only ever had 2 or 3 cars at a gathering, and we got 30, I think, together. If you have a look at the link at the top of the page, it'll take you to it. And we spent a week together in Orange, and just absolutely a fantastic event. Julie and I went along to photograph it, and we did a little book, which one of their members printed after it. Anyway, that's
great. The book is terrific.
The thing at Lake Percolilly, if you Google it or have a look on YouTube, there's some footage of it. It revived I think it was a pre-war event where they just went into the desert to the west of Perth and took a grader, made a circuit, and everybody got there and raced. And anyway, these people thought they might get 200 or 300 people if they were lucky. 10,000 turned up. Quite incredible. And one of them was a bloke from the UK. And there's a story on TV about him. Anyway,
it's quite incredible. You think about it. They actually built essentially the 3rd or 4th largest conurbation in the whole of Western Australia. By the time they'd finished, certainly in that part of the desert, they were the biggest place for hundreds of miles around. And we're back with Williams's, and I must say, I mean, the FW07 we can see here at the front is absolutely beautiful. That
was Donington, Patrick, and.
Yeah.
And what an amazing place, and the story of Tom Wheatcroft, what an amazing man. So
yes.
On our visit, and that would have been well over 2 decades ago, on our visit, it used to be a little cafe there that was as part of the museum. Anyway, we went in to have a cuppa after we'd whizzed round, and there was Tom Wheatcroft at the table beside us with Jerry Marshall. And they'd obviously been there for a little while because they'd built a pyramid of the empty beer cans. I think there was at least 12 on the table, and they were still going strong. And there was a little Alpha-based retro racer that Jerry had been testing at Donington, parked outside the thing. So I have no idea if he was driving home, but anyway.
Quite incredible. There's so much history, and so sad that the Donington collection has now been desecrated, because I can see the Cosworth four-wheel drive Formula One cars up on the left-hand side, that beautiful STP March 701 in the background, and that amazing row of Williamses from really the heyday of the Patrick Head Williams era when they were such a dominant motor car. Nowadays, unfortunately, their cars seem to drive a bit more like this machine.
Oh, come on! They were just off the backstop, weren't they, last night?
Yeah.
It's a Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost.
Yep.
And if people want to follow the link that's on the right-hand side of the thing there, you can read the history of it. But it was one of the very, very, very early armoured cars. That photograph was sent to me by Les Johnson, who we spoke about earlier with the Overlands. He's also got a very nice Silver Ghost, and quite an interesting story.
They're an amazing device altogether. But that brings us to a beautiful piece of history. Talk to me about these Healy Silverstones.
Well, I don't know. I don't think I'd ever met the one on the white one on the right, but the one in the middle, the red one, belonged to a friend of ours, Fred Vogel, and I think it certainly was featured on the front cover of a book, which I found and Fred didn't have, and Fred was in the book business, so that was quite surprising. Anyway,
was that book the Charles Mortimer book, Racing a Sports Car? Was that right?
I can't remember. I'd have to go and delve through the library.
I had a feeling that was actually the car, and it did a whole series of events in 50-51 with a husband and wife couple, the Mortimers, and they wrote up about doing all these sorts of things. It's quite amazing because they went just every event in the British Isles and a bit further afield with the car. I do believe that was the car originally.
And I think that car is now back in Europe. Anyway, the car on the left belongs to a gentleman called David Glean, and he's had that and raced that car for a long time. And one day at Wakefield Park, Paul bought the Silverstone Healey from Fred, and he had it down. He had it down at Wakefield, and he said, "Jeremy, would you like to drive it?" Well, I didn't need my arm twisted. And after doing a few laps in that, Davey came up and said, "Oh, would you like to drive my car?" And I said, "Oh, look, I'd love to." So I must be one of the only gentlemen in Australia to have driven, 2 Silverstone Healeys at the same place on the same day. And about a month later, David was driving his car at Bathurst, and he had a suspension failure. So luckily it happened to him and not to me, because it wouldn't have been a nice thing to hand the keys back to the owner, would it?
No, lucky escape altogether. And RIP as well, Fred Vogel, an absolutely fabulous Lotus aficionado, British sports car aficionado. He was a refugee who arrived in Sydney and really was just a wonderful man altogether. I think he passed away just a year or two ago.
Yeah, and if you have a look on my Smug Mug page, there's a whole lot of early Warwick Farm records that he'd preserved and which I scanned and put on the page, including you could go and have a look at Jimmy Clark and Graham Hill's lap times at Warwick Farm in the early days of the Tasman series. This car caught Patrick's eye, so we had to talk about it, and it's called the Viper, and it was called the Viper a long time before Chrysler decided to call their cars the Viper. And it's a home-built special, and there's a little bit of a stealth fighter about it. And anyway, Vic was telling me he ran it up the hill climb at King Edward's Park in Newcastle, and the police were there with the police radar trying to get the top speed of everybody going up the hill, and they couldn't get a reading on it. So, if you want to copy the design, you probably got the ultimate stealth car, and you can go and run around the roads at whatever speed you like.
It's absolutely magnificent. I mean, it's such a fascinating testament to the ingenuity of Australians, particularly at a time when they had unbelievable amounts of import duties that they had to take up, and therefore it was always a challenge to manage to get those cars together, which was
630 kilos, 250 brake horsepower. I think that would go all right.
Yeah, it's certainly much better than some of the others which had those fantastic names. I do love the car that they've been racing in historic racing for many years, I've seen, which was called the Wafton, which we won't spell it out at this time of the day, but it was generally felt to have not lived up to its initial potential in the design stage, let's put it that way. Sensational motor cars altogether, sensational array of photographs, Jeremy, just bringing us through your amazing collection of photographs that we've seen. Thank you very, very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your many very interesting asides, which we're going to get back to in due course. Thank you for the likes on social media. I really hope you enjoyed this first IPW live stream in Patrick's Wheels. Let me know what you would like to see covered in future episodes of In Patrick Wheels. Guest suggestions or nominations are welcome too. We're easy to find on social media through this channel, or indeed you can find me on LinkedIn, on Pinterest, on Instagram. I'm Patrick L. Young. It's not too difficult to find me. You can also track me down on Twitter, amongst other places. Of course, if anybody's interested by any chance in the next Mdina Grand Prix, which sadly because of COVID is not going to take place now until next year, it'll be in the middle of October 2021, send me an email. Happy to deal with you in my ambassadorial role there. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure to see Jeremy. He's taken us through aero engine specials, Nissan, all of sorts of fascinating cars the world over, some incredible accidents, some beautiful, beautiful 1950 sports cars, and above all, a number of incredible characters such as Jumbo Goddard, Paul Samuels, Fred Vogel, people who made motorsport in period and historic motor racing such an engaging topic. My name is Patrick L. Young. Jeremy Braithwaite, thank you very, very much from Sydney for joining us from Currajong Heights. Until next month, tune in for another episode of IPW Live. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be back on Facebook, Twitch, and YouTube. Until then, drive safely and enjoy whatever speed lockdown allows you, even if you have to settle for esports.